Hey there, it's Kurt Phillips. When we last left off, Will had gone back to Bart's to pick up some of his stuff and then fell down and was having a crazy flashback. Will saw his father sitting at the kitchen table, cradling a cup of coffee. He was looking at Will's mother, who was leaning in the doorway, wearing a fluffy plaid robe that in Will's memory she had worn every morning of her life. They were carrying on a conversation just as they had each day for the 39 years prior to his mother's death, paying absolutely no attention to their son, who was sitting on the floor next to the sink. Will tried to speak, to call out to his parents. He could feel the air enter his lungs and exit his mouth. He could feel the vibration in his throat and chest, but he could not make a sound. His mother made her way to the dishwasher, retrieved a mug from the top rack and washed it in the sink. Will watched his father as his father looked at her, listening, occasionally glancing down at the New York Times he had delivered a day late every morning, along with the Denver Post. Ellie Runner moved with her back to both of her husband and her son to the coffee maker next to the sink and continued to talk. He could see her shoulders move, and she shook her head the way that she had when she was telling a story. Will struggled to get their attention. He put up his hands and waved like a stranded motorist on the side of the road trying to flag down a passing car, but there was no reaction from either of them. The silence was brutal. Will closed his eyes and reopened them again and again, trying to wake up. He screwed up his face and clenched his eyelids shut. He placed his hands over his ears and attempted another scream. At that moment, Ellie Runner's head stopped moving, and she straightened her posture. Had she finally heard? Will jumped as she spun around. Her face was distorted, flattened and swollen, like she'd been horribly beaten. Her lips had turned an inky black. The upper lip split up to her nose, and her eyes had changed to a pale, cloudy blue. And in those eyes was a look of pure hate. The silence was finally broken by a shrill, unearthly shriek that came from her mouth, a mouth that was now full of jagged teeth. She crouched and then preternaturally leapt across the kitchen table, latching onto her husband's throat and knocking him back onto the floor. Will watched in horror as his mother dropped to her hands and knees over his father, pinning him as she lifted her head and hurled her new fangs down into his neck. She jerked with an inhuman speed as she ripped out his windpipe and shook it. It flew from her mouth and landed on the kitchen floor with a wet thud. She raised her head and turned to Will, finally acknowledging his presence. He kicked his heels into the floor, scrambling along the cabinets in the opposite direction. His father's blood dripped from her mouth as she opened it wide and shrieked to get another ghastly, deafening scream. Will jerked his head back, hitting it on the cabinet door. He closed his eyes and tried to cry out, and finally heard his own voice as he let out a coarse grunt. He opened his eyes to find himself once again sitting in Bart's office, alone, surrounded by papers and pens from the mug that he had once again dragged to the floor, the second time in as many days. He bolted upright, his heart erupting from his chest as huge drops of sweat swelled on his forehead. He wiped them with his sleeve and attempted to climb to his feet. He had no idea what he'd just experienced, but he knew that he needed to get out. He grabbed his fleece and jacket off the coat rack and shot out of the door, fumbling to lock it behind him. The cold air slapped his face, but felt soothing in his lungs. Will lurched off the porch and turned around, placing his hands on his knees to catch his breath as he stared at the house. He turned back around and sat on the bottom step, with his face in his hands, shaking. What the fuck was that? He wondered if he had passed out. Was it some kind of flashback? He didn't know. He wasn't sure. He was no longer sure about anything. The Hand of the Archer. Go check it out on Amazon or in Austin at Book People or at the library, or just read whatever the hell you want to read this weekend. Have a good weekend. Bye.